So it's not always affordable in the house of Citizen. And we're back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about the most expensive Citizen watch. Now, I know I don't normally talk about Citizen watches and Seiko watches. Personally, it's just not part of kind of the watch history and the watch collecting that I've done, and especially the type of watches that we sell at delraywatch.com. Go check it out, delraywatch.com. By the way, we have some very cool pieces that we got at the watch show. If you follow us, if you follow Federico Talks Watches, you know and you hear from us about all the cool pieces we got. A lot of it already sold out, especially the Rolex Sports models, but we still have a pretty few cool pieces, including a Polar Explorer and many others, a GMT Master. Check it out, delraywatch.com. Anyway, the watches we kind of handle day to day are typically just a little higher on the price point. It's just kind of our wheelhouse, right? Everyone has their specialties, but that doesn't mean anything lower in price point is bad. I mean, I can say that I've held and played with many watches that are more approachable, more affordable, and they're nice. They're fun, they're exciting, and it's definitely a great jumping point to get you into the hobby. And so I get messages all the time from guys that say, or even some girls that say, what about Citizen watches? What do you think about them? And then it's usually, somehow incorporated into a conversation about Seiko, because it seems like all conversations that aren't about Swiss watches are just generally about Seiko, and that's interesting, it's fine. But I haven't really talked about Citizen, and so I think it's very important to mention that the most expensive Citizen watch is actually not with the Citizen name on it. And I know what you're thinking. If you're a watch geek or a watch buff, you're probably saying, oh, well, that's probably the Campagnola, la la la, this is the watch that only I know about. Actually, guys, it's not a Campagnola, and if you're not familiar, Campagnola is basically Citizen's division that they now use Swiss movements and put them into entirely Japanese constructed, assembled watches, and they're a much higher price point, kind of in the same realm as Grand Seiko, but a little bit different, a little more artistic in a sense. I won't go into that anymore. I don't want to anger anybody. But actually, guys, the most expensive Citizen watch is an Arnold & Son Tourbillon. Now, if you're not familiar with Arnold & Son has been in the watch industry for a while. I mean, there's a long history and kind of like a story behind Arnold & Son, but I'll admit it's a little bit exaggerated and fabricated, as sometimes watch histories are, because, price points in the watch industry kind of come from the type of story you can convey in the message in an industry that's as old as time, literally. You have to kind of tell a story or have something very superlative. And they do make great watches, but the history is a little bit shrouded in exaggeration. But nonetheless, they've been making for about, I want to say 20 years. Don't quote me on that. It's just not a brand that, it's hard to follow the brand. But Arnold & Son has been making watches, and they have very high-end watches. They've got tourbillons, they've got, minute repeaters. They have some very complicated watches, and they're very nice. They're very fine, and they're polished to the point of where you can tell and you can feel that it's extremely high-end. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of the more complicated pieces. They have some more approachable pieces that they had roughly 15 years ago, when Arnold & Son was really starting to hit on the floor with their, with trying to make their own calibers and things. But in about 2012, Citizen was kind of just starting to make a big move. So they purchased Arnold & Son in about 2012, and they also purchased La Joux Perret. Now, we should back up a little bit, because this is what's very interesting about the story. And I know I'm a little bit scattered here, but I like to keep the video short and concise, and I need to just hit you with so much interesting information. I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. So when Citizen was originally founded, and I think it was originally called like Shikosa Factory in Japan, they basically took a watch manufacturing research facility and converted it into Citizen. And who financed this whole project, guys? It was the Swiss. There was a Swiss guy, and he went over there, and it's really difficult to tell what the intent was. It kind of seems, based on the data I've seen and all the stories I've kind of read and pieced together, that the Swiss, it was still very early in Swiss watchmaking for kind of the whole Renaissance up until today, from the early 1900s, and it was still very utilitarian and not so much about the history and the prestige of the Swiss name. I mean, they've developed that very much, tenfold over the last 100 years. And so, a Swiss guy went there and he saw the factory, and he was going to kind of put these pieces into his productions overseas, something along those lines. Like I said, it's very difficult to tell what the intent was, but they were trying to mesh together the Swiss and the Japanese watchmaking in some kind of manner or configuration. I mean, Japanese production and, assembly lines and lean manufacturing was still, kind of being formed there. And so that was probably an interesting thing for them. And so anyway, the Swiss guy, he puts all this money over there in Japan, and they kind of build up Citizen watches. Now, fast forward, going on through time and up until today, Citizen has generally been known for approachable watches, right? They've been, we're talking about things as low as $100 in current day, adjusted for inflation prices, or, they have some things that are like $500, $600, $700, $1,000, including pieces that are GPS calibrated. So you calibrate with GPS and uses satellites and things to make sure that the watch is regulated, and different quartz watches and more advanced like quartz watches and solar powered watches with the eco drive and all of these things. So they have a lot of technological innovations, but they haven't really been known for super high-end manufacture pieces. While they have had a couple of offshoots, like there was a Chronomaster that was supposed to compete directly with Grand Seiko in the late 90s or mid 90s. That didn't really go over too well. It was Japanese market only. On and on and on. Citizen has done some very interesting things, and they make a great approachable kind of entry-level watch, or just a good everyday casual, I don't want to say beater, but you know what I mean, the type of watch where you can wear it and certainly not be scared. And so, roughly in 2012, things started happening in the Swiss industry, and they saw Arnold & Son, and Arnold & Son, they make a great product. They make very high-end watches, and it was kind of purchased, by Citizen as more of a strategic thing than for their manufacturer. But actually, what came along with Arnold & Son was La Joux-Perret, and it's actually backwards. Like, Arnold & Son came along with La Joux-Perret. And so here's something very interesting about the watch industry, and this is something very few people are going to tell you, especially people that have their hands in primary distribution. The manufacturers are not going to tell you this. The brands, brands like Rolex, Patek, Audemars, Hublot, Omega, they will not tell you this, guys. These are some of the brands that don't do this the most, but nonetheless, in the Swiss watch industry, it is extremely common, and it was even more common up through the 90s, 80s, into the early 2000s, up until, let's say the last 5 years. When a manufacturer says we have a caliber movement, what they're saying may not necessarily mean that they made the watch entirely in-house with their own movement. So it was very common, and still is, for a brand, let's say Ulysse Nardin. My French is bad. But let's say that they wanted to, release a watch, and they wanted to say, this is our caliber, whatever, yada, yada, yada. What they'll do is they'll go to these manufacturers, these parts manufacturers in Switzerland, like La Joux-Perret. So you have these manufacturers, and the manufacturer says, we need so many pieces, we need it at this price, and then they'll either just take parts off the shelf, so they'll take modules. So what was very common is they would take an ETA automatic movement, like a 2892, and then they would take some module that like La Joux-Perret made, and then they would just, put that onto the movement. And so there's more to it, there's more engineering, there's more watchmaking know-how, but essentially these manufacturers would make parts and modules that you can kind of just slip into the movement with a little bit of crafty engineering, and it would turn a very basic, boring, off-the-shelf, low-cost, unimpressive movement into something that they could call their own and say, hey, this is our, caliber 591 or something like that. And so Ulysse Nardin was doing that for like the longest time, is they would take these boring base, undecorated movements, they'd slip a module in there, and then all of a sudden you have a big date, or you had a GMT, or you had a sub-seconds at 6 that never belonged on the movement, and they just popped the module on there, called it their UN module, and it's just kind of like white labeling parts. It's kind of like, I'm sure they do this in the auto industry, where you have a manufacturer of a vehicle and just the parts are interchangeable and they call it their own part, but in fact it's all produced in the same place. It's kind of like that. And so when you consider that what Citizen had turned itself into, and it had turned itself into like a great powerhouse for just affordable entryway, good watches. By the way, they are totally in-house. Citizen is totally in-house. It's a different type of, in-house. It means something a little bit different, but nonetheless, they made all their stuff in-house. Citizen is in-house. And by the way, they are the largest manufacturer of watches in the world per volume, including, Bulova. They own Bulova as well. They purchased Bulova a while back. So if you see a Bulova, you're actually buying a Citizen. And so what I'm trying to get at here, guys, is that when you see these names, there's a lot of times the parts are being shared, and if you're not like in the watch industry, and even if you're just on the forums, you might not see this. People don't like to talk about it. It's kind of like a dirty little secret in the watch industry that the manufacturers don't want you to know. They want to kind of sell you the story, much like Arnold & Son sells you the story, this very romantic story about a guy, in the 1700s and his son's like polishing wheels and all this stuff for, 1,000 years. It's interesting, and sometimes it's true, but it's rarely true. Usually they're using like Le Jeu Perret, which Citizen purchased, and they're just kind of manufacturing these things. And so, a little bit of a clickbaity title here, guys, but I had to drive home and I had to let you know that, these brands, a lot of brands in the watch industry are connected backwards through the manufacturers and the part manufacturers in some way, shape, or form. And so a lot of times when watch geeks like to debate about these things, oftentimes they're saying this movement's better, that movement's better. Like, guys, a lot of these movements are basically the same, and there's just modules dumped in there. Now, there's going to be guys in the comments that say, well, this isn't true, blah, blah, blah. Guys, leave in the comments below. Tell me what you think about this. Did you know that, first of all, did you know that Citizen owns Arnold & Son, and technically there's, several $100,000 and up Citizen watches, technically on the books, on paper, it's their watch. Now, different factory, different crafters and, watchmakers, sure, okay, but Citizen makes $100,000 watches, and it's something that's going on. Did you guys know this? Do you know of any other scenarios? I know of a few other scenarios just like this in my head, but I want to see if you guys know, because you guys are good. You leave great stuff in the comments, and you're even telling me things that like I haven't heard in a while or people don't like to talk about. So you guys know your stuff, you do your research, and I'm really impressed. So leave in the comments, did you know this? Also, if you guys can tell me what you think about Arnold & Son, I'd love to know. My personal opinion on Arnold & Son is that in the last 5 years, they have made some amazing watches, very high-end watches, of course with the aid of other parts manufacturers and things like that, but they've made some impressive classic pieces, well into the the teens and higher price points of thousands and thousands of dollars. But you can get a bit of an older Arnold & Son at a greater discount, so to speak. A few $1,000s. You can get kind of like one of the old like nautical themed or expedition themed Arnold & Son. What do you guys think about Arnold & Son? Leave that in the comments below. Anyways, just wanted to shoot out a very quick episode here for you guys because this was on my mind. I was thinking about Citizen watches for some reason. Someone left in the comments on a previous video, they're like, talk about Citizen. I'll admit, I don't cover Citizen a whole lot. It's not something that I'm that interested in, but what I am interested in is the business that Citizen has kind of created for itself. And so I'll make another video in the future after I kind of like, remind myself about some of the other Citizen watches and things and try to be a little more approachable with some of these watches. But I had to shoot this one out here and just kind of let the guys that didn't know about this know that these pieces are kind of just thrown in, and it was kind of like a strategic thing. And, now Citizen, they make several $100,000 watches. So it's not always affordable in the house of Citizen. Anyway, guys, this has just been another episode of Chatting with John P. Let's have a great week. Happy Monday, and I hope you're having a good one. Ciao.